I'm Lonita Cook, and this is The Artist Tree, the show devoted to art activism. Today, we're talking about professionalism and volunteerism. Professionalism is the character and spirit of someone skilled in practice in their craft or trade. Volunteerism is the practice of giving one's time or talents for charitable or educational purposes, especially to benefit the community. What happens when you put them both together? Sandy Woodson is what happens. Sandy has been a videographer for 20 years, spinning her gifts into a sensational career in film production, festival coordinating, a career in photography, and volunteering. A Renaissance woman, she is a mother and grandmother, regional Emmy-nominated artist, and art activist. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Woodson. Thank you so much, Sandy, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. And what I want to discuss in our interview is professionalism and volunteerism, because they both seem to be central to your career and your life. Now, you are a coordinator, you are a videographer, you are a producer, and I will want to definitely talk about the local show, the one that you produced specifically on suicide and depression. You've been with KCPT for 15 years. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to this point?
I actually started out in theater. So I did theater for 10 years, and then at some point thought, well, I'll never make money doing theater, so I better do something else, and I kind of went into video. And there's not a whole lot of money in video either, but I really liked it, and a lot of the things that I knew from theater translated with props and sets and things like that.
So were you directing, were you working in props in theater?
Mostly what I
backstage?
did was building sets, designing and building sets.
Nice.
And I love stage managing, and I love props, and I did some costumes. I ended up on stage, I directed once, I was a president once, all of that. When you do community theater, you end up everywhere. So I did a lot of that. So those are the things that translated into video. And then, so hanging out on shoots and things like that, I learned more about producing. And then pretty early on, and actually this is gonna date me, but I started editing when Avid started. So I kind of, yes, I know, that was a long time ago, but went to Chicago, got a beginning lesson, and just producing and editing are the two big things that I do.
Producing it, and when you say two big things, these are your absolute loves, your joys, or those are the two money makers for you?
Nothing's a money maker. Early on, I decided I was going to do what made me happy, right, regardless of the money, and so that's actually how I've ended up where I'm at right now. At KCPT, I've been there for 15 years, but I've gone off and on as freelancing. I did a 3-year freelance stint, and then my last stint as a freelancer led into my job at the front desk, and that seems like an odd way to go, but I wanted to do that because I would have a steady paycheck and insurance, but also work for a place I liked, and also be able to continue pursuing personal projects. So for the last year and a half or so, I've had a lot of personal projects, and it's freed me up to do projects I'm passionate about instead of having to do anything and everything that came across.
Now, when you say personal projects, I know that you're also a photographer, like you do stills and you show in galleries, correct?
Yes.
Is that what you mean by the personal projects that you like to do?
That, and well, I actually started a series of, started a documentary, a first full-on documentary for me on sustainability. So I've got 3 guys, an urban, rural, and a suburban. They're all trying to lead sustainable lives, and my idea is to track them for over the course of a year to see where they get and what they learn and all of that. And that branched into several smaller projects, and those smaller pieces are going to end up in the local show, actually, about a living machine. It's a system that takes all wastewater and turns it into drinking water through a system of plants and filters and things. there's just an amazing amount of things that are going on around sustainability. And so that is a personal project. And then the photography, because I've always loved that, never knew what to do with it, got involved with the Fringe Festival. They're very much like, do whatever you want. And I was like, okay. And so that's what I did.
So you also show your work during the Fringe Festival? And we were going to talk about the Fringe Festival a little bit later, but I do know that's something that you enjoy. Can you tell us what the Fringe Festival is?
It's a 10-day arts festival. It just finished the end of July. It's all kinds of arts. It's theater, it's dance, it's video, it's performing arts, it's everything. For 10 days, we're in 16 venues, and there are over 150, I think, performing groups. And over the course of that 10 days, there's almost 400 performances of one type or another. And it all happens down kind of in the crossroads.
In the crossroads. And I went to the Fringe Festival for the first time this year. It was awesome. And I saw a film at Crown Center. And the festival, does it happen inside of Crown Center, or is it all over? Because I know that like the pop-up art gallery had some things going on in there. How much does it tie in the community?
Quite a bit, within a 4-mile radius. I mean, we're in most of the big venues like Unicorn. Actually, we did our opening night party at the KC Rep.
Wow.
And for the first time this year, we were in the Lyrics rehearsal space. That was one of our venues, and the Bollinger Building, and then of course Crown Center in their theater, Union Station in their theater. I mean, we're all over, but it is a relatively tight-knit group because we're trying to make it easy for people to get around and go from one thing to the other, because these shows are boom, boom, boom. You go to one, you've got about 20 minutes to get to the next one. So.
And what specifically do you do for the Fringe Festival?
For the Fringe Festival, I ended up, well, ticketing and IT, and that was all by default because I am not an IT person, but I got computers donated from KCPT, and so it became my responsibility from there. So I make sure all the software is on there, I make sure that everybody's trained on how to access the ticketing software, and we have credit card swipers at all the venues and stuff, so that's kind of what I'm in charge of.
And the Kansas City Fringe Fest, there are two more questions I have. The buttons.
Yes. I'm so glad you asked.
Yes.
Because this is one of our biggest misunderstandings and something we want to emphasize each time we talk about the festival. The ticket money goes to the artist and the venue. None of that money comes back to Fringe. The only money Fringe gets is entry fees from the artists, and then it gets the button. Right. So everybody buys one button one time, $5, you're done. And if you don't go to multiple shows, I mean, the idea is to encourage people to go to more than one show.
Right.
But otherwise, basically it's a $5 donation to keep the festival going, because it's run completely by volunteers. Cheryl Kimmey, who's the director, works on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, all volunteer. And so we barely cover our costs. We do have some grant money and things like that, but between ticketing, between promoting the festival itself, and all of the incidentals like food and things like that, we don't end up with any money when the whole thing's over. And so I think if people know ahead of time that yes, there will be a $5 charge for a button at one point, there'll be less angry people when they come to the ticketing and they don't understand why.
The thing that I wonder about that is, why would you involve yourself in something like this when you don't get paid? I know that you said that regardless of money, you're going to do what you love. So talk about that affection for the arts that encourages you to volunteer.
With Fringe in particular, because I've seen how much it's done for me. I mean, I started out working with them when I was a freelancer and I didn't have anything going on, and of course all I'm doing is sending out resumes, and oh my God, I'm never going to get a job, I'm never going to have any money. So I thought, well, I might as well start doing something. And you get into it and you realize how even the little bit of time you give helps so much with groups that have nothing, and your skills get used. artist, and then it's like, oh, well, I'm not a loser, and oh, I do have some value, you know, and then when you do finally get your job, you've not spent all that time just chewing on your nails. You're actually helping people do things. Right. And then from the perspective of an artist, I would never have been able to hang my photographs. I don't know, I may have, but I mean, it's just, it's one of those things that I don't know that I ever would have done it, but at Fringe, you feel so, people aren't judging you, people aren't telling you they don't like your stuff.
So the feeling is very communal.
Absolutely, and very supportive. Right. So, and for whatever you want to do. So that really helped me. And so I like the idea that artists, that there's a place for people to go. There are people like Kyle Hatley, who's an associate director at Rep, or whatever his official title is. He was able to put on shows that he wouldn't be able to put on anywhere else, and it's dirt cheap. I mean, for like $300, you get 3 nights in a venue. We take care of ticketing. You get a tech. You get some basic equipment. Now it's down and dirty, but you can have a chance to put it in front of an audience without spending $2,000 or more.
Right. Wonderful. The other thing I did want to ask you about the Kansas City Fringe Fest, and then we'll move on. Is it associated with a national organization? Because I've heard other people talking about, oh, the Florida Film Fest, Fringe Fest, and so is it associated with a larger group?
It's actually an international group, and nobody's affiliated other than they're all trying to do the same thing. But it started in Edinburgh 40 years ago when there was an arts festival and there were some people not allowed in it, and so those people set up on the Fringe to do their stuff.
Of course.
So, and
that's
it's
how it always
over.
happens, right?
Exactly. And I'm heading to Chicago over Labor Day weekend to go to their Fringe festival, and a lot of the people in Fringe try to go to other ones to see if
how
nothing
it's
else,
done.
How it's done, you know, how
and
they
bring
do their
those
ticketing, what do they
back.
do with their credit cards, da-da-da-da-da, so.
Excellent, excellent. So when you go to other Fringe Festival, and so do you call them and say, hey, I work or volunteer for my local Fringe Fest, I'd like to come check yours out? Do they give you kind of a all access pass, or are you purchasing a button as well?
I would be purchasing the button as well, and the tickets, because number one, I know they don't have any money. They're like all the rest of us. But also, the thing is, I know how intensely busy they are right now when they're in their festival. So my idea is just to kind of go and observe, and then they do try to do a once a year, get some regional groups together so they can share information. And if I happen to be at a party and I snag somebody and I'm like, yeah, how do you do your ticketing, you know? But beyond that, I know how busy they're going to be, so I'm going to try to just stay out of the way.
And how long did you say KC Fringe Fest has been going on?
This was our 8th year.
8th year, and you've been involved how long?
3.
3, nice. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and take a commercial break, and when we get back, we'll back it up a little bit and talk more about the work that you do at KCPT. Okay, make sure you stay with us, and we'll be right back.
Mr. Johnson, it's time to start saving.
This savings wake-up call is brought to you by your friends at Choose to Save.
I appreciate you guys sticking around while I talk with Sandy Woodson. She is a videographer, photographer, and producer. She produced, well, you produced a 4-part series on depression and suicide, which was packaged into the local show for KCPT, and it was called the Local Show Special, correct? And it featured kind of 4 vignettes on people who lost loved ones to suicide. You talked about our own Don Harmon, who we lost to suicide, and some ways to combat depression and let's say avoid suicide. What made you want to tackle that issue?
I think, first of all, I'm very interested in mental health topics in general, and the local show, that's something that they want to keep pursuing in different ways. And then when Don Harmon killed himself, and it was right on the heels of somebody else, and then Don Cornelius, and it was just like, oh my, what in the world is going on? And then, so I talked to Nick Haynes.
And it's also prevalent because of Tony Scott and what
right
recently
now
happened.
it is. Absolutely. And what you realize as you learn more about this topic, it's unbelievable how often almost every person I know knows somebody who has either tried to kill themselves or have killed themselves, and many people know many. There are demographic notes that in the very beginning that I really couldn't figure out a way to put them in the show, but it's mostly middle-aged white men who actually kill themselves. There's more attempts with teenagers, and it is like the third leading cause of death for teenagers, but there's still more white middle-aged men that are killing themselves. And often they say, like one of the women I interviewed, they've been struggling with depression their whole life. Right. And at some point, something triggers or they're done. And you know, I think with the Tony Scott thing, I know that I think with Don Cornelius, he may have had a life-threatening illness or something.
And Tony Scott also.
And there's so many different reasons why people, and I think we started out, we were only going to do a 7-minute piece, and then you realize it's such a complex topic. There's so many forms of suicide, there's murder-suicide, there's the terrorist bombers, add into all the other things that you normally think of with suicide. With this in depression, in manic depression, which is something we covered as well, there are things that you can potentially do to prevent those things, where some of the other types of suicide you probably can't.
Yeah, there were, they talked a lot about manic depression or bipolar
disorder.
The bipolar disorder. And then they also talked about exercise and meditation and medication. So, and there was one story that I remember, I think it was a psychologist, I don't remember her name, but she was talking about the young girl that she was counseling who wanted to commit suicide, but she didn't want to tell her mother because her mother was already upset about her sister who had already committed suicide. What was it like working with people who had those types of stories to tell? I mean, how did that impact your work and the direction of your work?
It was wonderful. I mean, I had 4 or 5 people going into this. I didn't know much of anything, and that's the way I like to go into it. And I like doing interview-driven pieces. Right. So I go into it without a whole lot of expectations or anything. And the suicide hotline woman, that's Marcia Epstein in Lawrence, was referred to me by Bonnie, who was part of Suicide Awareness Survivors. Anyway, so it was kind of one of those things. I had a few people, then somebody recommended somebody else, and somebody recommended somebody else, and it worked out perfectly. Yeah, I think what Marcia was able to tell me is that people that are that close to suicide are not thinking clearly, and that's how they can help often, because it's an objective view back here going, well, now wait a minute, like she was saying, it is a solution, it doesn't have to be the solution. There may be other ways to fix your problem. Now, since then, in the last few, couple of months ago, my ex-brother-in-law killed himself. A couple of weeks ago, one of our Fringe volunteers killed himself. Wow. When you start opening your eyes, the thing is, people don't talk about it. Sure. And that's why Mark Alford, that was such a special interview. We interviewed him 3 weeks after Don Harmon killed himself. They were best friends. Right. We caught him we knew he wanted to, I went through people who knew people to go, would he be interested? Because I knew they really wanted to get this topic out there. And that's the only reason he did that with us. And I don't think he's ever seen the interview because it's so upsetting to him. And it was powerful to watch. I thank him so much for letting us do that. But mostly what people want to do, you see obituaries. A prominent man who killed himself maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, in his obituary written by the family, it says he died in his sleep at home. Right. So people don't want to... There is a stigma. Exactly.
And they did talk about that, it being the most selfish act possible. There is that stigma that if I do this, I'd be abandoning my children. I'd be, leaving those loved ones here to suffer. And yeah.
Well, there's that stigma. One of the women I hadn't seen in 20 years, we all got together. Her husband had killed himself the year before. And she said, at first, I didn't want to tell anybody because I didn't want them to think it was my fault. And a lot of families feel that way.
So is it something that we're seeing when you say that it's middle-aged white males And are you seeing that it's professionals or is it artists? I mean,
well, the man whose wife we interviewed in our show was a professional man. I mean, and he was deeply, deeply in debt at the time that he killed himself. But what she said is he'd been thinking about it for 20 or 30 years, and she spent a lot of her time just kind of chasing after him to make sure that he wasn't doing it. So her words of wisdom that I like, number one was, you know, instead of being at the bottom of the cliff trying to rescue the people who have jumped, we need to be at the top trying to figure out why they're jumping in the first place. And then the other thing that she mentioned was that, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Okay. That's okay.
That's what I get for more than one idea.
But that's okay, because like I said, I've seen the show. It was very poignant and touching. It was heartfelt, and you've been nominated for a regional Emmy for your work with that.
Right.
So how does that feel, being nominated?
Wonderful, because that was one project I did completely on my own.
You are involved with KC Film Fest, but it's a separate organization from the Kansas City Jubilee, Filmmakers Jubilee.
Actually, it started out as the Filmmakers Jubilee, then it turned into the AMC Kansas City Film Fest, and now that that's been bought by Alamo, I'm not sure what they're going to do, but yeah, I've been involved with them for 8 or 9 years on the programming side, and then I did do 4 years as the festival coordinator. But last year I was a projectionist, and that was a lot easier. So I kind of like that.
So, real quick, what would you say to people who are interested in either being involved in film festivals or submitting their work? I mean, are you involved with because I did talk to Jeff Scanlon, who is the
president. His title's changed over time.
And he talked about programming, and sometimes you submit your films, and it's not always about if your film is great. It's, do they have a place in the overarching story that they're trying to tell that year at the film festival? So what kind of advice would you have for filmmakers who want to submit?
The first thing I would recommend is you should be watching as many films. If you can be part of programming of any film festival, I would recommend that, number one, because you see, when you're watching hours and hours and hours of films, you start going, oh, that didn't work, and that's why. Or, yeah, that was a great idea, I'm going to try that. That is huge, because inevitably what happens is pieces are too long. So my first rule of thumb is, I mean, people think, well, I've got this great surprise ending at the end. Well, if you don't get to the end, it's not going to matter. So shorter is better. I think that's a pretty key point. But being a part of the programming and watching these local films is a great idea.
Excellent, excellent. And what kind of experience can we expect to have when we attend a film festival?
Each one has its own personality. Like KIF, some are curated, some aren't. I love the True False Film Festival in Columbia as well, because it's all documentaries, and I love documentaries. And they're from all over the world, and they bring in musicians and directors and all of that. With the Kansas City Film Festival, its biggest goal was to give a place for local filmmakers, but also to bring in things with shorts and features to let them see what their competition is. So that helps them go, okay, this is what my piece was up against, things like that. And KIF is more curated. I think they do 1 or 2 local pieces maybe, but they curate it. KC Film Festival is a competition. So you get submissions from all over the world, actually, and we're sorting through all of that, and we pick the best.
Yes, you do. And we're going to be wrapping up the show. I do want to ask you, before we go, what is your truest passion? So what are you doing, photography, videography, producing, when you feel most like yourself?
I think the most fun with photography, well, photography and writing. The last thing I did for Fringe, I combined poetry with photographs, and I like that a lot. So really writing is my #1 passion. I think I'd have to say. Writing, and I don't do that because it's my #1 passion. And so
and are you
it's
a
too
poet?
Personal. That's mostly what
fiction?
I write. No, more like poetry. And it's one of those things where I don't really care what other people think about it. It makes me feel good, so I've never really put it out there until this year.
Do you think you will?
I think I will again, yeah.
I hope you do.
It's fun.
Well, Sandy, it has been quite a pleasure talking with you. You are wonderful and so informative.
Thank you.
What you had to say, it was so informative. And I thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you're headed downtown to the Crossroads District for First Fridays, keep in mind that they not only have great restaurants, great theaters, but they have wonderful art galleries. And one of those galleries is the Pop-Up Art Gallery located at 2100 Grand. You go in and you'll see some wonderful local art. My name is Lonita Cook. This has been The Artistry, and we'll see you next time.